So today we are here to listen to Kim Roberts for her new book, A Literary Guide to Washington, D.C. D.C. isn't only a political town. It ranked second on Highbrow's list of top American literary cities and came in at number 8 on Nat Geo Traveler's top 10 literary cities in the world. There's plenty in D.C. for the litterateur to discover, from the Library of Congress to the places Henry Adams and Zora Neale Hurston lived and wrote. In her informative walking tour and anthology, Roberts, a DC-based freelance literary historian, writer, and editor, maps the city chronologically, taking visitors and armchair travelers through the places that shaped the works of figures including Francis Scott Key, Walt Whitman, and Langston Hughes, among many more. Please help me welcome her to Politics and Prose.
Thank you. Thanks so much for coming. Can everyone hear me? So this book tells the story of Washington, D.C.'s writers from the founding of the city in 1800 through the beginnings of modernism. So I go up to about 1930. And I focused on the city's early literary history because I felt that these were the stories that were less widely known. The book combines 4 neighborhood walking tours with brief portraits of individual writers of note. Some of these writers will be familiar to any well-read American, but many, I hope, will be new discoveries. Oh, look, it works. I've organized the book into 5 chapters corresponding to 5 sometimes overlapping time periods that mark the eras of the most ferment in the city's early literary communities. Chapter 1 has no walking tour, but all other chapters combine a tour with portraits. The book also serves as an anthology with poems and prose excerpts from each featured author. So what I decided to do was to focus on 6 authors from the book. 6 different authors than the talk that I did just the other day, just so I could, keep things fresh for myself. At any rate, the person who I wanted to start with is Francis Scott Key. A lawyer and DC's former district attorney, Francis Scott Key was a hobbyist writer. His only remembered poem was published originally as Defense of Fort McHenry, and Key wrote it after witnessing the bombing of Fort McHenry during the Battle of Baltimore in the War of 1812. Ironically, when it was set to music, it was set to a tune of a then popular British drinking song called To Anacreon in Heaven. In addition to occasional poems collected into a book that was published 14 years after his death, Key published a nonfiction book, The Power of Literature and Its Connection with Religion. Key lived in 2 locations in D.C., the Maples at 619 D Street Northwest on Capitol Hill still stands, although it's been broken into multiple condominium units. Another property once located on M Street in Georgetown was made into a museum celebrating the author, but was torn down when Key Bridge was constructed. However, across the street from that house location, there's now a park with a bust of the author. In addition to the bridge and the little park, Key Elementary School, part of the DC public school system, and Key Halls at George Washington University and the University of Maryland at College Park are named for him. Key also owned a country estate, a farm where he was born called Terra Rubra, which is Latin. It's named for the red clay of its soil, in Carroll County, Maryland, a property that was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1978 and is privately owned. Key owned slaves, most of whom worked at his farm, but during his lifetime, he was considered a racial humanitarian. What that means is he pursued dozens of legal cases to secure the freedom of enslaved families. Although he freed 7 of his slaves during his lifetime, Key still owned 8 enslaved people at the time of his death. Believing that people of African descent could never become full citizens, Key was also the co-founder of the American Colonization Society, which promoted the settlement of freeborn and formerly enslaved people in Africa. Charlotte Forten Grimké, I think I have a picture of on this. I'm going to skip forward and see. Charlotte Forten Grimké was born into the leading free African-American family of Philadelphia. She was an ardent abolitionist and taught freed slaves on St. Helena Island, South Carolina, for 2 years at the end of the Civil War. After that time, she settled in Washington, where she worked in an administrative position at the Sumner High School and for the U.S. Treasury. She gave up this work upon her marriage to the Reverend Francis James Grimké in 1878 at age 41. Her best-known writings during her lifetime were her articles published in mainstream white magazines, Life on the Sea Islands, published in the Atlantic Monthly, and Personal Recollections of Whittier, published in New England Magazine. Between 1855 and the late 1890s, Grimké published 15 poems in such journals as The Liberator and Anglo-American, and approximately the same number of essays in the Atlantic Monthly and African American periodicals. She also kept a diary that was published posthumously in 1953. Grimké was a dedicated community builder. She was active in the 15th Street Presbyterian Church, where her husband was minister. Oh, I have a picture of him. She was also a co-founder and one of the most active members of the Colored Women's League, organized in 1892, and a forerunner of the National Association of Colored Women. Beginning in 1887, she opened her home for a weekly Sunday evening salon where participants could discuss literature, visual arts, music, and other subjects of intellectual interest, as well as issues of civil rights. Anna Julia Cooper, I do not have a slide of. She is the author of A Voice from the South, a collection of essays published in 1892, widely considered the earliest book of African American feminism. Cooper taught and was principal at M Street High School and later at Frelinghuysen University. When she earned her PhD from the Sorbonne in 1924, she became the fourth African American woman with a doctoral degree. Cooper was born a slave. She married, but her husband died after just 2 years, and she never remarried, and they did not have children during those 2 years. But in 1915, her half-brother died, and she adopted his 5 children, raising them as her own. Cooper was in demand as an orator, and some of her most famous speeches were given at the World's Congress of Representative Women in Chicago and the Pan-African Congress in London. She helped organize the Colored Women's League of Washington, the Colored Settlement House, and the D.C. Colored Young Women's Christian Association. Cooper lived to the age of 105. Among the 12 famous Americans quoted in current U.S. passports, she is the only woman. Her quote is, "The cause of freedom is not the cause of a race or a sect, a party or a class. It is the cause of humankind, the very birthright of humanity." Henry Adams, also don't have a picture of him. You'll have to imagine him yourself. He's the grandson and great-grandson of U.S. presidents and was renowned for his novels Esther and Democracy and his memoir, The Education of Henry Adams. Adams moved to D.C. at age 21, prior to the Civil War, to serve as secretary to his father, Senator Charles Adams. The family rented the house at 2017 I Street in Foggy Bottom that is now the Arts Club of Washington. He later taught history at Harvard University and edited the North American Review. He returned to D.C. at age 39 to become a full-time writer and lived in the city until his death at age 80 in 1918. He published biographies of Albert Gallatin and George Cabot Lodge, a history of Mont Saint-Michel and Chartres Cathedral, and the multi-volume History of the United States during the administrations of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. When he sent a copy of The Education of Henry Adams to his good friend Henry James, he said, "The volume is a mere shield of protection in the grave. I advise you to take your own life in the same way in order to prevent biographers from taking it in theirs." Adams had the book privately printed in a limited edition of 100, which he shared with friends. The book was edited and re-released after his death in 1918 by Houghton Mifflin and awarded a Pulitzer Prize. It remains a classic of American literature and has never gone out of print. After his wife Clover's suicide, Adams commissioned his friend, the sculptor Augustus Saint-Gaudens, to create a memorial. Saint-Gaudens was the foremost American sculptor of the second half of the 19th century. He created the Shaw Monument on the Boston Common and the Sherman statue in Central Park, among other notable works. Adam asked that Saint-Gaudens create a figure that symbolized, like the Japanese figure of Kwannon, the acceptance intellectually of the inevitable. The memorial is set in an outdoor room or open-air chapel defined by a raised octagonal pebble floor, a granite bench defining one side designed by the noted architect Sanford White, and boxwood hedges surrounding the whole. The bronze figure sits on a granite rock imported from Quincy, Massachusetts, the ancestral family home. Did I say that this is at Rock Creek Cemetery? I did not. As Cynthia Mills writes in Beyond Grief, Sculpture and Wonder in the Gilded Age Cemetery, the scandalous circumstances of Clover's suicide and Henry's innate sense of privacy drove him to seek a newer conception of consolation than most sentimental funerary art of the time, something that synthesized Western and Eastern tastes, the rational and non-rational, and ultimately male and female. The memorial became a favorite retreat of Adams's, and he visited often, finding comfort in this contemplative spot. Adams was also interred at the gravesite next to his wife after his own death. His will stipulated no inscription, dates, letters, or other attempt at memorial should be placed at the grave. As poetic and evocative as the memorial seems, it has inspired an outpouring of responses, many of them written in actual poetic form. The poems began to appear in print almost immediately after Clover's internment, and they continued to be written. I've been collecting them, and I have found now about 25 poems written mostly by Victorian-era women poets who found somehow something about the memorial that spoke to them personally. I can, yes. So she suffered from depression, clinical depression. And she was very close to his father. After her father's death, she went into a depressive cycle that she could not seem to get out of. And she was an amazing photographer who she had many opportunities to publish her photographs, and her husband kept saying no. So she was an amateur photographer of professional skill. And so she committed suicide in a really gruesome way. She drank her developing chemicals and died at home. The sculpture of the Adams Memorial, the sculpture's mysterious form seems to seek continual reinterpretations of its meaning. The Adams Memorial is arguably the most important piece of figurative art in all of Washington, and certainly one of the most significant pieces of funerary art in the nation. It was a favorite retreat for Eleanor Roosevelt. John Galsworthy writes of the sculpture in his novel Two Forsyte Interludes. The writer and critic Alexander Wolcott, a member of the Algonquin Round Table, wrote an essay about it, as did former U.S. Poet Laureate Anthony Hecht. Mark Twain said it embodied all human grief and kept a print of the sculpture on display on a mantle in his home. Mark Twain lived in D.C. in 1867. We actually have a Twain scholar in the room, John Muller. Yay! He lived here a brief time, but a memorable time. He was working as secretary to Senator William Morris Stewart of Nevada, and Twain lived in a boarding house that was favored by journalists, where he terrorized his landlady, Virginia Wells. According to Senator Stewart, who also lived at that address, he would lurch around the halls pretending to be intoxicated. He would burn the light in his bedroom all night. Pretty soon, he took to smoking cigars in bed and ruined all her sheets with burn holes. Twain finished the manuscript of his book, The Innocents Abroad, while in D.C. His experiences in this city directly inspired his next novel, The Gilded Age, a satire of the city's political and social life, co-written with Charles Dudley Warner. His label for the post-Civil War period has stuck. It describes the economic growth, widening divide between rich and poor, and political corruption that are hallmarks of that era. Georgia Douglas Johnson, I think, is in here. So Georgia Douglas Johnson moved to D.C. with her husband, a lawyer, and 2 sons in 1909 or 1910. In 1912, her husband was appointed by President William Howard Taft to the prestigious position of Recorder of Deeds for the District of Columbia. Despite the demands of motherhood and wifedom, and not a lot of support from her husband, who urged on her the traditional homemaker role, Douglas Johnson was able to carve out time to write. In 1925, her husband of nearly 22 years died, leaving Douglas Johnson to provide for herself and 2 teenage sons. Through fierce will and hard work, she put Peter through college at Dartmouth and medical school at Howard University, and she put Henry Lincoln Jr. through Bowdoin College and law school at Howard. She did substitute teaching and worked as a clerk until she was finally able to secure a more stable and financially rewarding job as the Commissioner of Conciliation in the Department of Labor in 1925. Douglas Johnson was also a published syndicated newspaper columnist. Her column ran from 1926 to 1932. She managed a letter writing club, and she wrote short stories. Georgia Douglas Johnson was the author of 4 books of poems, 6 plays, and 32 song lyrics, making her one of the best published women authors of the Harlem Renaissance. Home of the Saturday Nighters Club, a literary salon, her house is one of the most important extant sites of the Harlem Renaissance period. Gathering weekly for cake, wine, and stimulating discussions, the salon brought together the era's young, ambitious writers, as well as older mentors. In the early 1920s, Jean Toomer approached her about hosting weekly conversations among writers here in Washington. Toomer felt that others, like him, might be feeling starved for intellectual company. Hosting these weekly Saturday night gatherings was a role that Douglas Johnson relished, as they undoubtedly allowed her not only to showcase her gracious hospitality, but the evenings also enhanced her standing among other writers. So we started this talk with one anthem, the Francis Scott Key National Anthem, and I will end with another. With her close friend, Madame Lillian Avanti, the first African-American to sing grand opera professionally, and also a DC resident, Douglas Johnson collaborated on several songs. Avanti composed the music to Hail to Fair Washington, a song which the pair hoped would become the city's anthem. It did not take. But among the song's lyrics are, Hail to Fair Washington, the place I love to be. I love the parks and avenues and every cherry tree. I love to stroll through Congress halls where all the laws are made, then pause by the Potomac where the weeping willows shade. It's great to honor diplomats from every continent and view the stately White House where dwells our president. Then from the lofty monument I proudly contemplate the city that belongs to me and every single state. Sing along. You can find all of these authors and more in my book. I should just say how pleased I am with what a beautiful job the University of Virginia Press did. The book includes historical photos, many of them provided by the Library of Congress. Hooray for the Library of Congress. Along with contemporary photos that were taken by a local poet and visual artist, Dan Vera. Some of you know Dan. And then these gorgeous specially drawn maps by Nat Case. So I hope you'll want to get the book and take some of the walks on your own. And thank you for your kind attention, and let's take some questions. Thank you.
Would you put up the next page, which has a tour on, and talk a little about the 5 tours?
Oh, okay. Yes, there are 4 tours. So the book is arranged chronologically. So it starts with the city's founding in 1800. Chapter 1 has portraits, but it does not have a tour. All the other 4 chapters have a tour combined with portraits. So as you can see here, I have focused on some of the most significant authors of different time periods. And I was looking for places where there was also enough sites close to each other that it would actually make a satisfying walking tour. So Walt Whitman lived and worked in the old part of the city, now the part that we refer to as downtown. And, downtown has completely transformed. So it's more of a exercise of the imagination when you take that tour. There are some buildings that would have still stood, and of course the streets would be the same. The layout of the streets hasn't changed. But for example, I found, I was really interested in finding out where he lived, and I found 7 boarding house locations, but they're all now the site of high-rise office buildings. So, you have to sort of imagine what the city might have looked like during the Civil War. The streets were unpaved. It was animals roamed freely. Instead of having regular garbage collection, that's how garbage was taken care of. And then the second tour is the Dunbar's tour, and I think actually might be my favorite tour in the book. It covers the period after Reconstruction. And Paul Laurence Dunbar, of course, is very well known. Most of us have read some of his poetry. But his wife was so incredibly talented, and no one remembers her. She was a writer of short fiction and poetry, and I love her poetry. But I think the tour is also particularly interesting because it was a time when government was just failing. The U.S. government had made these incredible strides forward in civil rights during Reconstruction, and then just gave up on it. And it's a heartbreaking period. The city was a kind of mecca for African American intellectuals, and then things just sort of, what can I say? I feel like we're still trying to finish the work of Reconstruction. Then the third tour is the Henry Adams one. You got a little taste of some of the Henry Adams material because I talked about him. And then the fourth one, probably the one that's most popular, is the Harlem Renaissance tour. And I guess the thing I'd like to say about that is the thing that's most important to me is that the Harlem Renaissance is a horrible name for that movement. It implies that it only happened in Harlem, in New York. But you can make a very strong argument for the fact that it actually started here in Washington, D.C. The people who were active in the Harlem Renaissance during the Harlem Renaissance didn't call it that. That was a name that came much later. If they called the movement anything at all, they would have called it the New Negro Renaissance, after an anthology edited by a D.C. resident and professor at Howard University, Alan Locke. The anthology is called The New Negro. Did I answer the question? Those are the tours. Yeah.
You mentioned a little bit about Clover, Henry Adams' wife, and that he didn't allow her to publish her photographs.
That's right.
Have they been published since?
Yes, many of them have. So her photographs are now in the archives at Harvard University Library's special collections. And so they have been, Harvard did an exhibit at one point of her photographs, but they have also allowed scholars to reprint some of them. And they're gorgeous. They're remarkable. She had quite an eye. They are of mostly eminent men of her time. They're portraits. Yeah. Yeah, she specialized in portraiture. She did some other work as well, of course. She did this series of outdoor seaside portraits of women friends of hers that I particularly like. But the famous ones are eminent white male scholars and intellectuals, which is, that was the crowd they were running in.
As you mentioned, a lot of the authors in this book are kind of not well known. Can you talk about that selection process and maybe some things that you learned along the way that you were surprised or excited to learn?
Yeah. I picked, of course, only authors that I love. So many of these authors, I think, why are we not still reading, I don't know, the poems of Charlotte Forten Grimké? They're terrific. The poems of Alice Dunbar-Nelson. But there's also, the very first employee of color of the Smithsonian Institution was a man by the name of Solomon G. Brown. And he was a leader in the Black community and a poet. And he was sort of asked by the community to write occasional poems for big special events. So a lot of his poems are, for the anniversary of this, for the, I don't know, the opening of this new, right. Right. So his poems, while some of them maybe don't rise to the same artistry as maybe Alice Dunbar-Nelson, are fascinating historical documents. There were just there's lots of new discoveries, and this was a time, the time I'm covering was a time when you would find creative writing in newspapers. You would have school children would memorize poems. Literature was considered more of something that belonged to everyone, not just an elitist thing you would go to, find in books. And it's, for me, very refreshing to go back to that time period and read the writing of that period. I love these writers. Yes, please.
Hello, my name is John Muller. I was already mentioned briefly. I'm a book about Mark Twain in D.C. as well as Frederick Douglass in D.C. I just wanted to briefly acknowledge Kim Roberts has been putting in a lot of work on the front lines of D.C. for a long time, since I was like a teenager. So I'm old now, and she doesn't recognize me because I have long hair. But she's been doing walking tours for a long time, and it's really wonderful that this book came out. If you haven't got it, please buy it. And I just wanted to, it's so kind of a question / statement / shout out, because Mark Twain, when he was in Washington, he had roommates, and a lot of these roommates went on to be interesting people. William Swinton is mentioned in the Grant's memoirs as being a journalist who almost was shot. That's a long other story. Also, George Alfred Townsend, that is my main man. George Alfred Townsend knew Frederick Douglass, knew Mark Twain. He was from the Eastern Shore. He's just a famous guy. And I'm going to say, because I actually go up to Burkittsville, Maryland. There's George Alfred Townsend. There's a correspondence arch to Civil War journalists. It was put up in 1896. It's like kind of in the middle of like almost nowhere, but it's cool to go to.
Has anyone been to Gathland State Park? Yeah. So Townsend published also under the name Gath, and that was his property.
Yeah. And Gathland wrote a book in 1872 called Washington Inside and Outside, which is a really cool kind of funky book. And yeah, so I just wanted to just give my own personal applaud to Kim, because she's been, a native, like, doing this work, and it's really important because she's brought a lot of scholarship to people's attention. And just thank you for doing this work.
Oh, thank you, John. Thank you, I appreciate it. So to just piggyback on that, I will say that one of the reasons why D.C. is such an important literary town is that writers came from across the country and around the world to be here to work as correspondents for their hometown newspapers. So we have just a huge number of people who were drawn here and lived here for periods of time, who professionally were journalists, but also were creative writers. And that has also made this a really unique story to DC. Other?
I've got one.
Thank you.
2 questions. One, what inspired you to begin this journey in the first place? And secondly, do you have an anecdote about Frederick Douglass?
Okay. So what started me on this was I moved here 30 years ago, and I was really curious about who were the writers here. I wasn't writing a book. I was just sort of looking into what was the literary history of the town. And then I developed a really personal relationship with Walt Whitman. So I was caring for a dear friend of mine who died young of cancer. And I had been teaching Walt Whitman's poetry for years and, was a big fan of the poetry. But I remembered that he had written some nonfiction about his experiences as a volunteer nurse. And so I went back to those. He wrote a book called Specimen Days about his experience. He lived in DC for 10 years. He came here specifically because his brother had been wounded and he wanted to find out what happened to him. And then he just stayed. He stayed on and dedicated himself to volunteering in Civil War era hospitals. And what he wrote about those experiences, he kept a journal and then wrote a book based off of the journal. It's incredibly moving, and at the time I needed something that would, I found it helpful. I found as I was going through all of the complex emotions of helping a dear friend die, to have someone else who had been caring for others who were dying, it was just so, it was moving to me. It made a connection that I hadn't had before. That's what made me then say, okay, where did he live in DC? And what I did was I went through his correspondence, particularly his correspondence with his mother, because what do you write home to mom about? You write about, what's boarding house life like? Who are the other tenants? Is your bed comfortable? Is the food adequate? So the letters to his mother really sort of opened up that whole, it made it more experiential for me. And of course, none of them exist anymore, but I was able to map out where they had been. Then I started, after I went through my Whitman phase, I started actually looking more at the Harlem Renaissance period next, particularly Langston Hughes, because Langston Hughes was a huge advocate of Walt Whitman's. That was the connection for me. So we think of Walt Whitman now as being like part of the American canon. Of course, everyone recognizes he's great, but actually his reputation went through several periods where he was, there were ups and downs. And one of those periods was during Langston Hughes's lifetime. And Hughes always credited Walt Whitman as one of the major influences on his own poetry. And as a matter of fact, there's this great story. Hughes dropped out of college and got a job on a steamer that was going from New York to the shores of Western Africa. And he was very excited about the fact that he would get to see Africa. He took all of his college books and he threw them overboard as the ship was going out of New York Harbor. The one book that he kept and took with him on a trip to Africa was Leaves of Grass, which I find incredible. So that led me to then look at, Langston Hughes lived in DC too. So there was things sort of steamrolled. I did not realize I was writing a book for a very long time. And the next thing I did was put together some tours and start leading tours. And I've been leading tours now for a couple of decades. And they've changed quite a lot as I've learned more, as I've done more research. So when people ask me how long have I been writing this book, I never know how to answer that question. Do I say 5 years or do I say 30 years? But this is, of long-term obsession. And your second question was about Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was just an amazing influence to such a wide range of DC writers. And what I include in the book is excerpts from one of his essays. A lot of his public speeches are very earnest, but he could write also, and occasionally wrote, humorous works. And so I include, I don't have a copy of the book in front of me, but I'm trying to remember the name of why, thank you. So the excerpt that I do from Frederick Douglass is called A Lecture on Our National Capital. This is why I couldn't remember. It's not a very memorable speech title, but I love it for how he makes fun of the way local politics work in DC. It did get him in trouble. You're right. And if you have not yet gone to Cedar Hill, his house has been preserved as a National Park Service museum. And it is so worth seeing. It's a great, you need to do it. It's, hidden gem of a museum. Take a break from going down to the mall. Go to Southeast instead. They preserve not only the house, but also most of his belongings. And they've recreated his writing studio, which had fallen into disrepair. It's this stone building with no windows at all that he called the Growlery. So I guess he did not want any distractions while he was writing. He did, yes. So he owned quite a lot of real estate. So he built some houses for his sons as well that are still standing. He made his mark physically on the city as well. Oh yeah, it's a great view across the city. That's right. Well, I want to thank you again for coming, for all your kind attention, and for helping me celebrate DC's very rich literary history. Thank you.